Welcome to the Trellix Spotlight series. My name is Nick, and I will be your host. Today's session will focus on endpoint security, firewall, and web control best practices. This webinar will be recorded. If you prefer not to participate in the recorded session, please feel free to disconnect at this time. A link to today's recorded presentation will be emailed to all registered attendees. This webinar is a brief overview covering common use cases and scenarios regarding this topic. It is not intended to be all-encompassing. If assistance is needed, please contact Trellix Technical Support. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the Q&A window. This webinar may run longer or shorter based on your participation, and we recommend asking as many questions as you can to make the most of this series. If the Q&A window is not displayed, click the tab at the bottom of your session window and click on the Q&A icon. We will answer the questions during the final section of this webinar. If you experience any audio issues during the webcast, please drop and attempt to reconnect. Our speaker today is Alan Carter. Alan has over 13 years of experience with Trellix products and currently works on supportability initiatives within the organization. Ladies and gentlemen, Alan.
Good afternoon and welcome to the third in my series of best practice webinars for Endpoint Security 10.7. In this session, I'm going to be focusing on firewall and web control modules, going over some settings for each. Again, as per previous sessions, I'm going to try and focus on settings that are not enabled by default or that have specific considerations or gotchas when deciding whether to use them or not. That will be followed by a short demo in which I'll be going over the multi-slot behavior for web control, block and allow lists, as well as content reactions. And finally, there'll be some knowledge-based resources for more detail on any of the topics covered in this session. So we'll dive straight into the configuration overview of the firewall settings. So the first policy we're going to discuss is the options policy. In fact, this is probably the policy we'll be discussing the most because it contains all of the firewall settings except for the debug logging options, which are in the common options policy. If you need to enable firewall debug logging for any reason, that's where you would go and do it. Typically, debug logging for firewall is not used for tuning firewall rules or anything like that. The standard logging should be sufficient for that. Debug logging is more typically required for when something really unexpected is happening with the firewall and we need additional logging to see why it might not be working correctly. And of course, it doesn't include the firewall rules, which is the other firewall policy, which I won't be going into too much detail on because it's literally just rules are rules, but I will be giving some guidance on that as well, just not drilling down into the level of defining the specific rules themselves. The options policy is also where you can enable or disable the adaptive mode feature. And I'll talk about that a little more on a later slide. It's also where you'll set your GTI response posture settings for the firewall. So depending on JTI ratings for domains, you can use those ratings to determine block or allow rules, depending on your use case. This is also where you have some user access settings, which again I'll cover in more detail in a next slide. You can define a list of blocked domains. This is separate from the block and allow policy from web control. This is essentially just blocking all connections to specific domains. And again, I'll speak about that again in a moment. And finally, and most importantly, I would probably say is it's in this policy that you are able to set your defined networks in terms of the networks within your networking arrangements. and also to define trusted executables. So these are applications that you trust implicitly, effectively all the communication that they send or receive, you are trusting. So let's dive in to the first setting that is not enabled by default, and this is possibly the most complex one, but essentially it's allow traffic for unsupported protocols. Essentially, if this is enabled, it allows all traffic, and it's a binary, it's allow or it will block all traffic where ether type is unpassable. And if the ether type is unpassable and you have this enabled, then that traffic would be allowed across the firewall. Whereas if this is not enabled, then that traffic would be automatically blocked. This applies to the Open Systems Interconnection or OSI model for short, layers 1, which is the physical layer, and layer 2, which is the data link. So an example of OSI layer 1 is raw bit streams over a physical medium. And OSI layer 2 is protocols that do not, so it's a step beyond a raw bit stream. It's actually a defined protocol, and at the OS layer 2, you're defining the frame of the protocol, and that frame does not contain a definition for the ether type in the packet that's contained within that frame. Yeah, essentially, pretty much all TCP, UDP, and standard protocols do have some sort of encapsulation for the ether type, but then there are some rare ones, particularly older ones, that do not. And so those are what we consider these unsupported protocols, because we can't recognize the ether type. And that's where this rule comes into play. If you are using any of that sort of protocol in your environment for any reason, this rule would need to be enabled to allow that traffic across the firewall. The next option I wanted to discuss is allow only outgoing traffic until firewall services have started. So this is essentially a security option, which is sensible to enable, because obviously the firewall depends on a service that takes some amount of time to start during a system boot. And if you have other applications also starting at system boot, they may be attempting to send traffic already before the firewall service has started. So for general purposes, this is a good thing to enable, particularly on a say a client machine, just to make sure that the service is running before you start processing any traffic that may be going in or out of the machine. But you do need to be aware that it can impact startup applications that rely on network traffic during startup. So if you do have critical applications that need to make some sort of communication during startup, and there is a risk that the firewall service might not be started at that time, then this is something that you want to make sure is not enabled in that sort of environment. Or at least that the application can recover once the system is up and the firewall is started, and then it would reattempt any network communication that it was previously blocked on during the startup. And the other one is allow bridge traffic. So bridge traffic being traffic that's bridged across multiple network connections. So I just wanted to call out one important thing here, which is that this only applies to incoming and outgoing packets if the destination MAC address is in the supported VM MAC address range and isn't a local MAC address on the system. So this means that it applies to VPN, virtual adapter bridging, things like that. But it's not going to apply to a local bridge across local adapters, for example. The next one is a big one, and probably read this first note in red, bold. I didn't want to make it too gaudy on the presentation, but there is a group in here in the rules set called McAfee Core Networking. And there is an option in the options policy to disable these rules. And I just want to call out that this should be done with the utmost caution. Doing so without placing any other rules that you've devised yourself in the rule set may result in clients becoming unreachable. Specifically, if you're configuring this from an EPO policy and pushing the policy down to the client, and you're disabling all the rules and blocking all the communication to that client as a result, no further action you take from EPO is going to unblock that machine. Essentially, you're going to have to physically go to that machine and undo the enabling of the firewall to block all traffic, essentially. So if you are considering removing core networking, you want to make sure that you're either in adaptive mode, so that you're allowing all traffic on the system and learning rules as the system operates, or that you have defined appropriate alternative rules in your rules policy to allow essentially what core networking rules allow are critical system traffic, DNS, as well as Trellix application communication. So you can expect, if you've disabled core networking and you've not placed anything to either learn rules or apply alternative rules, then all of this sort of traffic is going to get blocked. Carrying on in the options policy, another one that is not enabled by default is treat Trellix GTI match as an intrusion. So when we talk about a Trellix GTI match, we're essentially talking about domain ratings and IP ratings. And depending on your action enforcement for the firewall based on ratings, it would be reasonable to assume that you are blocking at least sites with IPs and URLs that are known to be malicious. And so with this option deselected, then the difference being is that it'll still block, you'll still be obeying your GTI blocks and so on for IPs and URLs, but it's going to essentially generate a specific event, an intrusion event, and essentially it's going to display an alert and you'll get an event back in EPO. So that's really something that you want to enable if you're interested in identifying access attempts to known malicious sites, and to get an event that you can action on the back of that. This does have a sub option, which is if Trellix GTI rating server is not reachable. Default, it's set to allow, but obviously if you set this to block, then you need to understand that the consequence of this is that if a site or IP does not have a rating, sorry, let me rephrase that. So if you set this to block, if for any reason your GTI communication is down and you cannot get a rating for an IP or a domain or something like that, then the firewall is going to take the default action to block until that communication is restored. So you may find that, for example, internal sites or web apps, things like that, which typically might even not have a reputation, but they'll be blocked anyway, just by the simple virtue that we couldn't even go and see if there was a reputation for it. And finally, you have an option for block all untrusted executables. So this goes a step further, and essentially where you have where you can define your trusted executables in terms of your trusted applications for which you trust all traffic that emanates or is received from them. this will basically enforce that list so that only those applications are allowed to send and receive communication if they are defined in the trusted executables list. Anything that is not defined there would be automatically blocked. There is then an option for log matching traffic. So this will provide additional logging if you are essentially trying to check if your rules patterns are matching your traffic correctly. It will give some additional context for this beyond the standard incoming, outcoming process and IP details that are provided in the standard logging. I would caution, however, that this should be used for troubleshooting or during initial tuning, because the additional information that it collects, such as attempting to resolve IPs and things like that, will lead to a performance degradation, especially if the activity is elevated. So yeah, this should be a targeted option if you are trying to identify matching criteria on a specific event. These options are distinct. So these are options in the options policy itself. If you go look at defining a rule in the rules policy, you'll see that there are two distinct options there that look very similar. And those are treat as intrusion and log matching traffic. And those are probably the better place to use those options rather than globally in the options policy itself. As I mentioned, in the options policy, that's better for an initial tuning or troubleshooting. Whereas if you've identified the rule that you're specifically interested in, then it's better to turn on these options within the rule itself. And I would suggest that you only ever use these rules for these options for rules that are set to block, because those would be the ones that you would be particularly interested in. And rules that are set to allow will potentially be very noisy, and it goes back to the previous comment that even though you're only enabling it on the rule, if that rule is particularly noisy on that system, then again you're going to be seeing a performance impact from this additional logging and event alerting. So bear that in mind. The recommendation is to only use those settings on rules that are defined to block. Moving on, we have some settings that relate to providing users with some control over the ability to disable the firewall. This is a global disabling. Essentially, you are allowing them to switch it off, bypassing all rules, all options, anything that's configured in the policy. Just selecting this option in isolation allows the user to disable the local firewall, but it only takes effect until the next policy enforcement interval. So typically that will be 5 minutes by default. The policy would be enforced every 5 minutes. So allowing the user to disable the firewall for 5 minutes would allow them potentially to test some application that they suspect is being blocked by the firewall. But there should be some sort of log entry, both client side or in the log to advise if some specific traffic for that application is blocked. And I would expect that to potentially become part of their justification in the second bullet point on this page. So that's an option to use with caution for power users, perhaps, with the security that obviously you know that it will be reinforced within 5 minutes if they forget to turn it back on. When you select this option, it will also open up a secondary option, which is to retain user disabled firewall status when this policy is enforced. So this is going to override the automatic re-enabling of the firewall. So this again is to be used with additional caution, because this isn't going to guarantee that the firewall will get re-enabled. The user would have to remember to re-enable it. So selecting this option will give permission to the user to permanently disable their local firewall effectively. And that's why you want to use extreme caution with who you give permission to do this. And then the third option here is to require justification from users when they are using this option to disable the firewall. It's essentially just a free-form prompt for the user to enter why they are disabling the firewall, and details of the justification that they provide will be sent to EPO under the event ID 35009 if you want to audit those justifications. Next, a couple of notes on adaptive mode. The adaptive mode is essentially a mode whereby all traffic is allowed both inbound and outbound while adaptive mode is enabled. It should only be used during initial tuning phase on a small set of representative clients. Leaving it enabled provides no protection to the client because all traffic is allowed. And the reason you want to do it to only a small subset of clients is because essentially it's going to be in a learning mode, and it's going to be generating learned rules and sending those rules over to EPO for an admin to be able to review them and apply them into a rules policy as they see fit. So this results in an event overhead. Every rule that's learned requires an event being sent to EPO. And therefore, obviously, the longer it's running, the more active the system, the more event overhead is going to be generated. So you need to bear that in mind. The audit on the EPO side as well, obviously the volume of rules that you end up having to process is a direct result of how long it's been running and how many events have occurred in that time on the client. And so in that respect, doing it for defined periods of time and then processing the rules and then maybe putting it back into adaptive mode for a bit longer and seeing if any other rules come up to be processed, and just keep doing that operation, gradually adding into the defined rules list, will minimize the amount of rules you have to process in one go when defining your rules policy. And so it's essentially just a way to split up the work. Rather than have to define 100 rules in one go, you could split it up into short bursts of maybe 20 rules at a time or something like that. And with all of that, in particular, the event overhead, this can result in EPO performance degradation being caused by this being left on indefinitely and on too many machines. This is something that just to call it out, this is something that has impacted our EPO SaaS platform, where whether intentional or not is unknown, but some sets of machines have been left in adaptive mode for extended periods of time, and the events build up in the tenant's database and leads to a general degradation in performance. And because it's a tenant-based cloud system, this can not only impact you within your organization, but other customers as well, sharing the same infrastructure. So we do have a plan to introduce some sort of timeout mechanism specifically for adaptive mode in EPO SaaS in the future. with a view to not avoid you using adaptive mode, but just simply to limit it so that it doesn't get left on and forgotten about indefinitely, essentially. So the current idea being that we'll set a timeout value to it so that it automatically disables itself after a set amount of time, and therefore reduce the amount of bandwidth that it's using if the setting is forgotten about. And finally, in the firewall section, options section, you have 3 sections where you can define some lists of things and how to deal with them. So the first one is the block DNS. So this is just this is essentially a blacklist of domains. So what you would do here is simply list any FQDNs, fully qualified domain names, for domains that you don't want any traffic, any connection to be allowed to that domain. So what you're going to define the FQDN, and what the firewall will do is it will resolve any IP addresses that the client is attempting to connect to, and if they match any of those FQDNs specified in this section, then the connection itself would just be blocked outright, and it won't even go any further to analyzing traffic or anything like that. The whole connection will be blocked. The second section is defined networks. So these are networks that you trust. They would typically be your internal network ranges, whether that's specific IPs, sets of IPs, entire ranges, subnets, etc. When a network is defined here, all traffic across that network is allowed. So any internal traffic to that network is allowed, and it bypasses the rules that are defined in the rules policy. When you define a network, that you have that option to set it as a trusted network, and that's when the traffic is allowed and it bypasses the rules. You can also define a network as untrusted, and when it's untrusted, it will exclude that network from any GTI related allow rules in the rules policy, and it will bypass GTI lookups for those networks. So even if that network was rated in GTI as safe, clean, green, defining it yourself as an untrusted network is essentially going to block the traffic from that network, irrespective of its rating. And finally, you have trusted executables. I mentioned these briefly earlier. So anything defined as a trusted executable means that all traffic is allowed for that application, bypassing all rules in the rules policy. The minimum amount of information is the process name, so the executable name. But obviously, I would highly recommend you to define at the very minimum the MD5 hash of that process as well. And even better, the MD5 hash and the signer of that process to ensure that it's a legitimate application. Bear in mind that will entail maintenance in terms of being aware when the application version changes. It will have a new MD5 hash and could potentially, if they've renewed their certificate, have a new signing certificate. So that would be something that would need to be maintained for your trusted application list here. So the other policy for firewall is the rules policy. And as I said earlier, I'm not going to go into the minutiae of defining a specific rule, but I just want to highlight some gotchas and just an overview of how the rules list works. So the rules are processed from top to bottom, with the first matching rule being the one that is applied. What that means that is, if you have a rule higher up in the list that is going to block a given item of traffic, a given traffic event, then that event will get blocked and it will never reach a rule that you may have defined lower in the list to allow that same traffic that matches whatever criteria you've defined. Which means that your allow rules should always effectively be above your block rules. And then the last rule in the stack of rules is actually hidden, and the rule essentially is to block everything, which means that if it gets through all the list of rules and the traffic has not matched any of the criteria for an allow rule, then it will hit this hidden block all rule right at the bottom of the stack. And if you ever see an event saying that your traffic was blocked due to the block all rule, that's what this means. It means that none of the rules in the rule set match the criteria of this traffic. So then you want to be looking at what the event says in the logs in terms of the source, the destination, the IP, the process, the port, the protocol, and so on, and check if you actually have a rule defined to allow that. And bear in mind also that if you specify other criteria such as location aware groups or applications or so on, then all those criteria also need to match. So just because you have a rule that say allows TCP port 80 for application edge.exe, for example, that is not going to allow port 80 traffic from Firefox.exe, for example, because Firefox is not listed as an application for that rule. So yeah, like as hopefully just made clear, all matching criteria must be true for a rule to take effect. And you can use the options to log allowed and block traffic to determine which rule is taking effect. Now, allowed traffic by default is not logged, only blocked traffic is logged. And the reason for this being that you're probably more interested in blocked traffic, and allowed traffic is probably going to be very, very noisy if you enable that. So that's why it's disabled by default. There's very few cases where you would probably log the allowed traffic. The only real use case for that would be just to prove that some traffic is getting through that you expect to be blocked, and then to figure out why it might not be matching the criteria for a block rule. But certainly don't leave it enabled for long periods of time. It's gonna use up a lot of overhead on the client system. So that was a review of the firewall settings that I wanted to go over. And this next section is even shorter. It's some web control settings that I just wanted to call out that are not enabled by default, or again, might have some gotchas that you need to be aware of. So the options policy has settings for web gateway appliance usage. So if you are, so the thing to bear in mind is that web control is a local client module. And so it will be using your policy settings locally on the client in order to enforce certain actions. A lot of these actions can be taken at web gateway level rather than on the client. And if you have that provision in place, then you will want to be looking at these options in your web control settings, because at that point, the web control becomes almost like a secondary protection for the client when it's outside the influence of your web gateway controls. So if you're using a web gateway appliance, you can select this option, disable if a web gateway appliance is detected. And when you select this option, you're going to get 3 further options appear to select from. You can use your organization's default gateway. So this is basically going to just use your network adapter gateway and assume that the web control enforcement is being enforced at some point at that gateway. And then if when the system is connected to a network, it is assigned that gateway, it will recognize that it's in that environment that has web gateway provision, and it's going to essentially stop enforcing the local policy for web control completely, because it's going to rely on your web gateway controls in that circumstance. The second option is to detect web gateway enforcement, and this relates specifically to our web gateway products. And so this is going to be a broadcast essentially by our web gateway to say that something's been checked and that web control can essentially stand down. Or if you're using a third-party provider, you can specify an internal landmark to use. So that's if you're using a third-party web gateway solution, that will allow you to integrate with them. And again, provided that connection is available, then web control will stand down and allow your third-party web gateway to enforce any control actions. Similarly, there is the option if you're using our sister company SkyHigh Client Proxy. So that is a locally installed client proxy. So if that's installed and you enable this option, then again, web control with the local policies is going to stand down, and it's going to let your SkyHigh client proxy take over in terms of all web filtering controls and whatever controls you've set on your SkyHigh solution. So basically, these are when you're using a web gateway solution or a SkyHigh client proxy solution, but you still want a local web control settings and GTI site ratings to be enforced when you're outside their area of influence. So if the user is just connected to their home network, for example, and they're working off VPN or something like that, or sat in a cafe somewhere off VPN, and you just want some essential URL control, web controls in place, blocking malicious sites and so on to protect your assets, with your company assets. And finally here on this slide, just a quick comment about observe mode. Very similar to adaptive mode on the firewall. It's going to be used for tuning. It's not going to enforce any block actions. Essentially what it's going to do is just log events and what action it would have taken if it wasn't in observe mode. So again, this is used for tuning. You don't want to have active clients in observe mode, because then web control is not offering any protection to those clients. It's also causing overhead on those clients without any protection benefit on them. So again, this should be used for small subsets of machines for tuning purposes, observing what's going on, and then using those observations to define what your actual policies are going to be for your active clients that are being used. The other policies I wanted to discuss briefly. I'm not going to go into the action messaging or content enforcement options, because I would hope that those are pretty self-explanatory. It's just what messages to display the user based on what action you're taking. And the content enforcement is basically blocking categorized sites based on their category, essentially. So maybe you want to just globally block gambling sites, or globally block news sites, or whatever it might be, political sites or something like that. So hopefully those are self-explanatory. But what I did want to talk briefly about is the block and allow list policy, and in terms of it being a multi-slot policy, and to also just call out that the other policy for content actions is also multi-slot. So what is a multi-slot policy? Essentially, it means that multiple policies can be assigned to a client. So it's not a singular policy. You have the ability to assign one or more, up to any number of policies to a single client, whether that's via group assignment, specific system node assignment, or policy rules assignment. Each method will allow you to either define one policy to assign, or you can define multiple policies to assign. So what does this mean when you have multiple policies assigned to a system? What it means is that you essentially come up with an effective policy, which is the combination of all these policies that you've assigned to the client, with the most restrictive settings taking effect by default. So to give a really simple example, your policy A blocks the URL abc.com, and your policy B allows connection to abc.com. Your effective policy is going to be the stricter rule by default. It's going to be to block abc.com. Your allow rule will be present in your policy, but the block is going to take precedence, which means that you should review any policy assignment rules that you might have that could potentially create conflicts with different policies being applied to the system. And there is an advanced option in the block and allow list. If you click on show advanced options, there's a separate tab, and it will allow you to enable allowed sites to take precedence over blocked sites, which will effectively invert this behavior. So the example would become the opposite. So your policy A and your policy B remain the same, but instead your effective policy now allows abc.com, because there is an overriding allow rule in the set of policies that are assigned to this machine. The content actions policy is also multi-slot, and it behaves exactly the same way, except that you do not have that option to invert the behavior. It will always be the strictest, most restrictive setting that will take effect in the effective policy. So let's move on to a quick demo. I'm going to quickly run you through the settings that we've discussed, and then I'm going to give you an example of the multi-slot policy, so you can review that and how it works. Okay, so let's start with the firewall options policy. We'll just run through this quickly because I really want to show you the multi-slot behavior, how that works. So here we are in the options firewall policy. We had to click the show advanced to get a lot of the options that we discussed to show up. So here you've got the setting for the unsupported protocols and blocking all traffic, all outgoing traffic before the firewall service is started, and also here the allowing bridged traffic. This is also where you'll turn on the adaptive mode or disable the core networking rules. Again, I remind you to use this one with caution. I didn't call this one out in the slides, but this one is relevant if you are using adaptive mode. So retain existing user added rules and adaptive mode rules when the policy is enforced. So if you are using adaptive mode, make sure you turn this option on, because otherwise when you disable adaptive mode, all those rules that it learnt during that period would get purged. So you want to keep this on until you've completed reviewing the rules and implementing them in your rules policy, and then it's safe to turn off this option here. Down here you have the GTI network reputation options I discussed. So the treat Trellix GTI matches an intrusion, log matching traffic, and block all untrusted executables. And then down here you have the setting. By default, it's going to block traffic if the GTI rating server is not reachable. Alternatively, you can set this to allow traffic unless it's specifically blocked by your rules. Down here, you have the status control settings. So allow users to disable the firewall from the Trellix tray icon. And if you enable that, then you get that second option I referred to, which is basically it will remain disabled until the user switches it back on, rather than at policy enforcement. So again, caution when using these options. And then there you've got, just underneath, you've got the requirement for justification from the user if they are using that feature. Down here, you have your DNS blocking. So this is, as I mentioned, you're just going to enter just domain pattern matches. It could be fully qualified. It can be partially qualified. So you can have star.google.com if you really want to block all Google domain, for example. Your defined networks are added here. So as I mentioned, you can define them as trusted or not trusted, and you can define them in multiple ways, either as a single IP address, a subnet, a range, a fully qualified domain name, whatever is most appropriate for the definition of the network. And down here, finally, you have the trusted executables section. So here the name is just a label. You'll define the file name or path here. It can include wildcards, but obviously the more specific it is, the more defined it is, the better. And here you can enter the MD5 hash and the signer. I'd highly recommend using these. But again, bear in mind, obviously, you need to be aware of when versions change and update these accordingly as they get deployed in your environment. Because obviously, if you haven't defined these, well, if you've defined these and the user goes and updates the application, then the risk is that the rule won't match anymore because either the signer changed, or more likely, if it's just a version update, the hash changed. Just to show very quickly, in the rules policy, when you add a rule here, you do have these options I mentioned, the treat matches intrusion and log matching traffic. So just bear in mind, I recommend that these only be used in block rules, and they're more targeted than the global rules in the options policy. So more efficient for a specific troubleshooting of a specific application. Moving quickly over to the web control, because I'm conscious of time. In here you have your web control settings that I mentioned. So here, if you enable your web control, web gateway appliance being detected, here are your 3 sub options. You can have any number of them, and they are defined in different ways. As I said, the detect web gateway enforcement is a broadcast, whereas these you would define either your internal gateway or your third-party web control solution. Disable Sky High is similar to Web Gateway Enforcement. That's more of the client is installed on your endpoint. So if you know you're using that product, then you can enable this option. Don't think. So here, yeah, this is the other option I mentioned. So this is block sites by default if Trellix GTI rating server is not reachable. So assuming your internet connection, your internet traffic is flowing freely across your firewall. We're now on web control side of things. So we're specifically looking at URLs and URL reputations. So if for any reason you have a GTI communication failure going on in your environment and you're trying to get to a website that is not rated, or that you know has a green rating, the simple fact that you can't connect to GTI is going to still block that site because it's not able to recover that rating. So this is going to be very problematic if you have an unstable GTI connection within your environment. So obviously disable this, and then your priority should be to resolve your GTI connection issues before re-enabling this option. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a lot of stuff getting blocked. And again, here you've also got the observe mode setting, similar to the adaptive mode for firewall. Essentially, as I mentioned, it's going to generate events, but nothing is going to be enforced. Down here, just to call out, this secure search is going to curate search results for searches in various search engines. I would just call out, though, however, that this is only available on Internet Explorer. Otherwise, what you get in the other browsers is just going to be the site ratings down the search results. Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to quickly give a demo on the effective policy when using a multi-slot policy. So you see here that I have got 3 policies defined. Hopefully they're pretty self-explanatory from the titles. In this policy, I'm essentially blocking google.com. In this policy, I'm essentially blocking bbc.co.uk. And in this policy, I'm allowing bbc.co.uk. And you'll see that I've assigned these 3 policies to my test client, 10 Marvin. And we're going to go over and have a look and see what the effective policy is currently on that system. I would call out, excuse me, that I have not yet enabled the rule that allows the allow rule to override the block rule. So the expectation here would be that our effective policy with these 3 combined is going to be that both BBC and Google are going to be blocked. So over here, if I edit the policies on a single system, you can see that I have these 3 assignments. And if I go look at my effective policy, I'm going to see that I have my block Google, my block BBC, and my block and my allow BBC in this one. If I go to my client now, just make sure it's got the latest policy. And I attempt to go to Google. We're blocked correctly. And if I attempt to go to bbc.co.uk, they are blocked correctly. Okay, now if I go back to my policy catalog and I go into my, well, I'll just go into my block BBC one first, because I just want to show you here that in my advanced settings, I can't save, he says. It wouldn't let me before, but this setting here, allowed sites take precedence over blocked sites. This policy itself doesn't actually contain any allow actions. Okay, so this isn't really the appropriate place to tick on this option. The appropriate place, and when I tested this earlier, it wouldn't actually let me save the policy. I don't know why it's letting me save this time, but the appropriate place to tick that option on is in the list that includes the allow action. So here now, if I tick on this option and I go back to my client and enforce my policies, so now I'm expecting my effective policy to block google.com, but the allow rule on bbc.co.uk should override the block rule on bbc.co.uk. So again, if we go to Google, I should get blocked. There we go. But now if I go to bbc.co.uk, I'm allowed. And I can continue to browse around. So that concludes the short demo. Thank you very much. And now I'll pass you back over to Nick to close us out.
Thanks, Alan. As a reminder for everyone, Trellix Education Services offers exceptional training to go along with our award-winning products. If you would like to learn more, please visit the website listed on your screen to see all of our offerings. Now let's get our Q&A session started. I see we have several questions, but it's not too late to add your question. Please type it in the Q&A window to submit. Additionally, take a moment to fill out the survey. Your feedback and suggestions are always appreciated. Can you deploy ENS threat prevention, firewall, and web control in one deployment task from EPO?
Yes, you can. When you create your deployment task, you have the option to add additional modules via the plus and minus buttons to the right of the deployment task. So if you wanted to deploy the full ENS suite, for example, you would select the 5 modules: platform, threat prevention, firewall, web control, and ATP. And those can all be contained within a single agent deployment task.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one.
I see we do have, sorry to interrupt, Nick. I see we have just had a really quick question in as well in the chat, and it's about adaptive mode. Where do you find the events to add to rules? So you find the events on the client that you are running adaptive mode on. They will show in the local console, and in the local console, you have the facility to export those rules into your EPO policy.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that, Alan. And I do see the question about how to register for the training products. I'm dropping the link here for you there. That is how you would find our training classes and how to enroll in any of those on your side. All right, perfect. I think that's all the questions that we have for today's session. I want to thank everyone for joining today's webinar, and a big thank you to our speaker, Alan. As a reminder, a link to today's recorded presentation will be emailed to all registered attendees. This concludes today's webinar. Stay safe, everyone.